Did the Pope just say that Catholics need to return to Orthodoxy? Well, as we'll see, in some ways it kind of actually sounds like that, especially in the recent address to the Eastern churches where he says how the Western liturgy needs to learn from the East to recover a sense of mystagogy and beauty, and how in the West we need to get rid of spectacles and consumerism from our liturgies. Does this mean that we are going to return to something like the Latin Mass? And then we have him emphasizing a return to synodal governance, which was mainly the structure of governance in the early church and still is amongst the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox today. Now, this is really interesting because this is something the Eastern Orthodox have been criticizing about the Roman Church for almost 1,000 years, and especially since Vatican I. So is this a way forward for Eastern Orthodoxy's reunion with Rome? But that's still not everything. He talks about not just the importance, but the necessity and medicinal nature of reconnecting with the spirituality of the East and that of the early church. But what's even crazier is that this is not some sort of new ecumenical trend or political move. It's actually something that was already proposed over a century ago by his predecessor. In fact, Pope Leo XIII explicitly commanded that any Latin clergy who tried to poach Eastern Catholics should be removed from their position and punished. It's quite extreme. And now, over 100 years later, Pope Leo XIV is bringing back that exact same sentiment to the center of the Church's mission. The document strongly states, "Over a century ago, Leo XIII pointed out that preserving the Eastern rites is more important than is generally realized. He went so far as to decree that any Latin rite missionary, whether a member of the secular or regular clergy, who by advice or support draws any Eastern Rite Catholic to the Latin Rite, ought to be dismissed and removed from his office. We willingly reiterate this appeal to preserve and promote the Christian East, especially in the diaspora." So here we see quite a different tone than some other popes have taken in the past, especially before Vatican I, which was a little bit more hostile towards the East and a little bit more strong in their language. And this is a total shift in tone, not just something that's post-Vatican II, but actually even pre-Vatican I with Pope Leo XIII. You already see a different shift in tone towards the Eastern rites and a very strong emphasis on preserving them and the necessity of keeping in close contact with the whole Church. The document continues, "In addition to establishing Eastern circumscriptions wherever possible and opportune, there is a need to promote greater awareness amongst Latin Christians." So it really sounds like Pope Leo and all of you guys watching need to subscribe to Lungs of Faith right now, as my analytics tell me that 95% of you who watch this channel are not subscribed. What are you guys doing? Subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment, share it with a friend, because this is what this channel is all about. It's about breathing with both lungs and promoting Latin Christianity, about promoting Eastern Christianity, about promoting Oriental Christianity, and promoting dialogue and real discussions and learning about each other's traditions, not in some false ecumenical way, but in a very, very real way. And so, the document continues after this. "In this regard, I ask the dicastery for the Eastern churches, which I thank for its work, to help me to define principles, norms, and guidelines whereby Latin bishops can concretely support Eastern Catholics in the diaspora in their efforts to preserve their living traditions, and thus, by their distinctive witness, to enrich the communities in which they live." So there's a real kind of idea of bringing the Eastern Christians more close to the Latin Church and having Latin Catholics learn more about the Eastern churches, and even in our diocese and in our diasporas have a bit more of a close relationship together, which I think is a really positive thing. Now, while this is really interesting, we should take a look at something that's a bit more pressing, and that's the issue of synodality. And so the word synodality can tend to evoke very strong emotions among some groups of Catholics, especially in the West. The more traditional Latin Mass type of attending Catholics, they tend to get a little irky around the word synodality, and the reason for that might be because of the synod on synodality, or maybe because of a certain understanding of what synodality actually is, maybe a dislike for the involvement of laity in decision making. But regardless, let's take a little bit of a closer look at this and what the Pope actually has to say about it. Is Pope Leo XIV on board with synodality? Is he kind of more in line with Pope Francis on this? Well, let's take a look. So the question we're going to ask is the Pope wanting to go back to a greater emphasis on local governance and decisions of local synods over the more monarchical position of the Pope since medieval times? And could this model actually be beneficial for liturgical diversity and freedom, such as for Latin Mass communities? Well, it's no secret that the Synod on Synodality, think of it what you might, has made its mind known to the world with its desire to revive a more synodal structure within the Roman Church, which, believe it or not, is not a foreign concept. Pope Leo XIV built on Pope Francis's desire to return towards synodality, so he actually affirmed the conviction of Pope Francis that the Eastern churches are to be cherished and esteemed for the unique spiritual and sapiential traditions that they preserve, and for all that they have to say about the Christian life, synodality, and the liturgy. So the truth is that in the first few centuries, no one denies that the church operated primarily through local synods and regional councils, with bishops governing their own communities simply in communion with one another. And something that both Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox can actually agree on is that Rome, in this sort of model, held a place of honor and a place of dignity. But in the Catholic view, Rome was honored as a court of final appeal and a center of unity, but it did not yet exercise the same universal and administrative control that would later characterize the more high medieval papacy and onward. Though I must add that this doesn't mean that it didn't possess the ability to or the potential to, which is where we might differ a little bit with some Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. Now, if you're enjoying this type of content, please do not forget to support the channel through super thanks on YouTube, or consider becoming a supporter or monthly supporter on buymeacoffee.com, links in description. For just as little as $10 a month, you can really help advance the mission of the Lungs of Faith channel. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead and donate right now. Back to the video. And so how do we exactly explain what developed out of the papacy later? Well, by the High Middle Ages, it's no secret that the papacy had evolved into a very powerful and centralized institution wielding very tremendous amounts of power and political control, with Pope Innocent III famously claiming authority over kings and councils. Now, the Gregorian reforms actually strengthened papal control over bishops, and by the time of Trent, the Roman Curia was at the center of nearly all ecclesial governance. Now, say what you will, but this system brought efficiency and doctrinal unity, especially in times of heresy and schism. It was much easier to sort of control the situation and unify the church when you have a single point of contact, but it also arguably marginalized local churches and led to overly juridical and dry approaches to theology and liturgy, and at times quashed legitimate diversity in those things. And we see this with the Council of Trent abolishing most of the Western liturgies that existed in that time and summing them up into one Roman rite as a response to the Protestant Reformation. And this is important to note because many Catholics would be rightly asking, well, how on earth can we actually reconcile this with Vatican I? Isn't it totally clear that the Pope is the absolute universal authority over the whole church? Well, yes, but from what I actually see, returning to a synodal structure wouldn't necessarily violate Vatican I's papal supremacy view. It would just potentially adapt the way that the papal office is exercised effectively. So possibly it would be more of a move motivated by prudence rather than one of walking back on dogmas. So we'll have to see, is this enough for the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs to actually come on board with Rome, or is the resounding issue of papal primacy remaining a stumbling block? Well, let's see what Eastern Orthodox opinions have been on these matters in the past. Orthodox theologians like Metropolitan Callistos Ware have long critiqued the Western model of papal supremacy while affirming the primacy of Rome as a historic and spiritual reality. Ware argued that the Bishop of Rome could be seen as a servant of unity if his role is understood not as a unilateral ruler but as a first amongst equals, a primacy of love exercised within synodality. So although there are still fine theological points that are very important to comb through, in this light, synodality is actually not really anti-Roman, but a potential opportunity to reframe the Roman office in a way that's more beneficial and more faithful to the undivided church of the first millennium. Now, impacts on liturgy. A synodal church might allow more liturgical flexibility and responsiveness to local needs, and this is much like the early church and Eastern traditions. For example, local bishops could approve liturgical adaptations in language, in posture, hymnography, chant, etc., and communities could recover an organic, enculturated expression of the liturgy rather than adopting some uniform global rubric. So pros of such a freedom is better cultural and pastoral sensitivity to the people. So obviously obviously in the more synodal structure of the church, you have a bit more of control over local customs, and this might be beneficial for pastoral reasons, as we've seen in Latin Mass communities, etc., etc. Another pro is the recovery of liturgical traditions. For example, the Mozarabic rite in Spain, or local Marian feasts, or the Sarum rite, or so many of the other Western rites that kind of went under after the Council of Trent. Another pro is the encouragement of participation and ownership amongst the faithful. So this is really true. I mean, if you have a more local governance, you will have a more local flavor, and the people in the community might feel a little bit more involved in the liturgy and a little bit more closely connected to the liturgy and a little bit more proud of their own unique expressions, so long as they are Orthodox and so long as they follow the guidance of the local bishop. Now, cons and risks of such a move are potential erosion of liturgical unity and coherence, and you could also have a rise of quasi-nationalist or ideological liturgical experiments, as we have seen maybe in the Russian Orthodox Church, maybe with the Old Believers, or maybe with some of the more nationalist, national salvation type movements that have occurred there. And I think we've also seen some strange stuff like that in the South Americas. And then you also have the danger of turning the liturgy into a battleground for partisan theology. Like I said, with the Old Believers, we have seen this. Certain traditional Latin Mass communities, we have seen this with Sedevacantist groups. So these are some things to think about, but more specifically on the liturgy, there's a lot more our new pontiff has to say that echoes some of these sentiments. Now, the question many of you are probably asking is, what does this mean for the Latin Mass? What's going to happen with the Latin Mass? Are we going to see an undoing of the restrictions? Are we going to see a signing of Summorum Pontificum? What's going to happen? Is it going to be more widespread? Is the Pope going to celebrate the Latin Mass? And these are all good questions. Well, I think there's several layers to this, but first let's examine the papal document and see what it says that might have some people thinking this. It says, "The Church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense." So of course with this statement, you see a great emphasis on how the East can offer us something for our Western liturgy. That means that we need something from the East, and that means that it's kind of an admission that there may be a sort of I don't want to use the word deficiency, but a sort of deficiency in our liturgy in terms of liturgical practices, liturgical customs, maybe mystery. And we'll see here next, it says we have a great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies. Liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. Again, so you have the use of the words, the great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies, right? So it's kind of an admission that there's something beautiful that the East has that perhaps we need to recover, and perhaps we have a need to take a closer look at what the East is doing. And I think all of us probably agree with this general sentiment, no matter where you fall on the spectrum. I think there is a deep need in the West to rediscover some of that mystagogy, some of that mystery, and some of that beauty that the East has to offer. Maybe some of the iconography, maybe some of the iconostasis, maybe just some of the theological kind of focus, the Christocentricity, and not saying the West doesn't have that, but maybe a sort of return to more of the Eastern early church type of flavor. And then it continues, "It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, again, a sense of primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the value so typical of Eastern spirituality, constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity, penthos." And so again, we see this very strong language of the need to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the value so typical of Eastern spirituality. So this might have some people wondering, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean we're going to go back to the way it was at the Council of Trent? Does that mean the liturgy is going to go back to the Missal of Pope Pius V? Are we going to go back to the Latin Mass? Because the Latin Mass definitely has that mystagogy. And so I can see how some traditionalists are reading that into it. So nextly, it goes on to say, "It is vital then that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake of perhaps practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism." So there's clearly a deep appreciation here for the reverence, mystagogy, and humility found in the Eastern liturgies. and rightly so. If you've seen my video titled Roman Catholic Reacts to First Orthodox Divine Liturgy, you will know how profoundly I was impacted by my first encounter with the Byzantine tradition. The mystery and the beauty and the penitential tone, it all left a lasting impression, and that's why I still attend the Byzantine liturgy very frequently. And at the same time, I've noticed that some traditionalist commentators interpret these kind of affirmations, especially from recent popes, as signaling and as a call to return to the Tridentine Mass of the Missal of Pope Pius V. And I can totally understand where they're coming from. The Latin Mass is undeniably rich in mystery, in solemnity, and a sense of the sacred that transcends time. So there's certainly points of convergence with the Eastern rites and the Latin Mass, but I wonder if that reading might be just a bit too narrow. Hear me out. This document and others like it seem less like a call to restore the forms of the past to me, and more like an invitation to kind of recover the spirituality that's preserved so vividly in the East, which might in turn create a sort of renewal in the liturgy, and in turn create a bit more of a return to that tradition and that deep reverence that we see in things like the Divine Liturgy and the Latin Mass, but not maybe specifically the Latin Mass. And that raises an important question. Is returning to the Latin Mass necessarily the same thing as learning from the East? Perhaps to some extent, yes, especially in the shared emphasis on the transcendence and reverence and the ad orientem facing, things of that nature. But when you look at the broader context, Pope Leo XIV seems to be pointing towards something just maybe a little bit deeper than that, and that's the spirituality that is lived in the East. And the Latin Mass, for all its beauty, is shaped by a different phronema, and phronema is kind of a word that they use in the East to represent a sort of different mindset. And so I think it's a really deep call. When I read this document, the Pope is really calling us to return to the phronema, or the mindset of the East and the early church. And the Latin Mass, for all its beauty, is shaped by a different phronema and a different mindset. It reflects more of a medieval Western theological heritage that emphasizes clarity and structure and precision, and much of which occurred due to theological battles with heretics and Protestants and so on. And sure, it was necessary in its own time and its own place, but is that necessary anymore for our current times? And that's a treasure in its own right. But the East offers a kind of liturgical immersion where the senses and the emotions and the whole person is drawn into the mystery of Christ. I don't want to risk sounding here reductionistic, and it's my fault if I come off sounding this way, but it's less about legal formulation and strict adherence to ritual and more about sort of existential transformation. And I think if you attend both the TLM and the Byzantine Rite with an open mind side by side, you will feel this. And I think this really makes sense, because if we go back to the fathers always talk about how the liturgy is rooted in the spiritual life. And if we don't have a spiritual life that reflects that kind of transcendent beauty and deep connection with God, then it's going to be very hard to have a liturgy that reflects that kind of beauty, right? So I think what the Pope is calling for here is not just a return to rubrics, but it's something a little bit deeper, and something that here on this channel we talk about quite a bit, and that's the importance of the iconographic and incarnational understanding of Christ, and not just in the Eastern sense, but in the sense of the whole church, in the sense of the early church and the church fathers. And it's really about allowing the spirit of the East, which is their submission to the mystery, and their allowing of their intellects to be in submission to the mystery of the liturgy, and their liturgical wholeness and their humble trust in tradition to shape how we pray and how we fast and sing and worship. Now, I want to comment on where it said, "It is vital then that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake of perhaps practicality and convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism." And this is very interesting language. So I can see how this is being interpreted as a critique of certain liturgical abuses that have happened in some Western parishes, like the influence of consumerism through overly commercialized concert-like worship music, or utilitarianism seen in the rushing or shortening of masses for the sake of brevity and convenience. And those are real issues that are worth addressing. But I want to offer another perspective that might broaden how we think of this. Take, for example, the Low Mass in the Latin tradition. A Low Mass is fully valid and celebrated according to the traditional rubrics of the Latin Mass, but it is done quietly and without music and without chanting, and is often quite brief, sometimes under 45 minutes and sometimes even much shorter than that. And what's ironic is that this critique of utilitarianism was actually originally aimed at the Low Mass itself. It was part of the rationale behind the liturgical reforms of the 20th century, the concern that some expressions of the liturgy had become overly functional or minimalistic, losing its sense of full and active and communal participation. And to be fair, my first time when I attended a Latin Mass was actually a Low Mass, and as I've said before, I didn't even know when the liturgy started. Like, I just saw the priest up there and there was absolutely nothing, like no sound. The priest was saying all the prayers quietly and there was some movement, but it was overall very quiet and I was completely lost. I couldn't hear the liturgy, and then it kind of, communion came around. I'm like, oh, the Mass is happening. Okay. So, I mean, of course, there's beauty in the Low Mass, and I still attend the Low Mass quite frequently. I find it prayerful and beautiful in its own right, but I can see how people might come away with that criticism of it. In contrast, Eastern liturgies and even Western liturgies before the medieval period had no equivalent to the Low Mass, and there was no cutting down or simplifying of the liturgy for the sake of brevity and convenience. Everything was celebrated in full, communally, and it was deeply and richly symbolic, and sometimes went on for a boring amount of time. And I just think of this YouTube channel, this Ethiopian Orthodox YouTube channel that I subscribed to. One time I saw like a post and said Divine Liturgy, and I was like, okay, cool. So like I look at the thumbnail and I look at the little timestamp in the bottom corner, it says 9 hours. So I'm like, okay, there's no way. So I click on it, I scrub through, and yes, indeed, for all 9 hours, the people were celebrating. And I'm like, this is unreal. Like, people in the West complain when a liturgy is sung for over an hour. Like, I know people who are like, oh, we're doing a sung Mass, I want a Low Mass because the sung Mass is too, like, man, could you stand a liturgy for 9 hours, So I think the deeper point here is that the Pope's critique is not necessarily aimed at one form or another. At least that's the way I read it. That being said, will we go back to Latin in the liturgy? Well, I've heard rumors, though unconfirmed, of Pope Leo XIV celebrating the traditional Latin Mass and also the Novus Ordo in Latin. So it's possible, but it would be quite the deviation from the trajectory of Vatican II and the idea of accessibility. In fact, most Eastern Orthodox theologians and commentators are famously against the use in modern times of Latin, especially for formational parts of the liturgy like the Epistle and Gospel, in favor of accessibility. And the Eastern Catholic bishop who made a significant impact on the Second Vatican Council regarding the use of vernacular languages in the liturgy was Patriarch Maximus IV, Syag of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church. As a prominent Eastern Catholic leader, he advocated for the preservation of Eastern traditions and emphasized the importance of using vernacular in liturgical celebrations. Patriarch Maximus IV argued that the early church conducted its liturgies in the languages understood by the faithful, such as Aramaic and Greek and Latin, which were the vernacular of the time. He questioned the necessity of maintaining Latin in the Roman Rite, especially when it had become a barrier to active participation for many congregants, and he stated that Christ offered the first Eucharistic sacrifice in a language which could be understood by all who heard him, namely Aramaic. Never could the idea have come to them, the apostles, that in a Christian gathering the celebrant should read the texts of Holy Scripture, sing psalms, preach, or break bread, and at the same time use a language different from that of the community gathered there. His advocacy contributed to the Council's decisions to permit the use of the vernacular languages in the liturgy, aiming to make the services more accessible and spiritually enriching for the faithful. Now, personally, I don't really know which direction this will go in, although I have a feeling that the synodal mindset, we could see something more like a return to the days of local governance and decisions being made prudentially in different settings, which might just be what the church needs right now in order to breathe properly. Now, seeing how Pope Leo XIV is a pope of surprises, and pleasant ones at that, it isn't impossible. So definitely let me know if you would like to see a return to Latin or not in the comments, and also let me know if you are Roman Catholic, Eastern Catholic, or Eastern Orthodox, or Oriental Orthodox. I'm really curious to see where everybody stands on this topic. And as always, don't forget to breathe with both lungs. This is Zach from Lungs of Faith, and until next time, God bless.